All right, to this now, the meteorite that flashed across the sky over the Eastern Cape just over a week ago has a possible name. Nqweba has been proposed after the town where some fragments of it were recovered. A collaborative effort to study the find is currently underway. The partners are Rhodes University, the Nelson Mandela University and the University of the Witwatersrand, while the initial scientific focus will involve microscopic and geochemical analysis of the recovered meteorite fragment to fully classify it and understand its origin. The fragments were on display at a media conference in Gqeberha at NMU. Now, to speak more on this, let's now welcome Professor Roger Gibson from the School of Geosciences at Wits University. Prof, thank you so much for your time. Well, seeing that this has reportedly only happened roughly about 51 times in the country, one can understand certainly the fascination here. Just talk to us about your initial analysis of the meteorite fragments and, more importantly, of course, how you would have established that, firstly, the rock is indeed a meteorite.
So, and hello to everyone. Yes, it's been a whirlwind. We're probably we're only about 9 days from the actual event, so it's been quite a scramble. But we have the option of doing an initial analysis macroscopically. So we've just inspected the sample under controlled conditions. So the first thing is that the sample is coated by a very thin layer of black melt, which is the sign that it was part of a fireball that came through the atmosphere. So that's the first sign. And then it's an unusual rock type in that what we can see is that it's made up of broken pieces of rock in a very fine floury matrix. And this is quite characteristic of the surfaces of many bodies outside of Earth, such as the moon and such as many asteroids, that the space missions that we've been seeing to many of the asteroids in recent years have shown contain a very loose agglomeration of a very powdery soil called the regolith. So this looks like it's part of one of those objects.
Yeah. And Prof, if you can, just unpack the significance of this find. I mean, both from a scientific and cultural perspective. We know, of course, there is a team, as we've said in our introduction, of professionals who are working together, from various institutions. But how far are you in your investigations, just to, amongst others, determine where this meteorite origins are and perhaps its age and all of those fascinating points?
Well, if it's a meteorite, its age is essentially almost the age of the solar system. So these objects link to the formation of the solar system. So that's 4,570 million years ago. So some of the oldest features we have. We believe this one is of an asteroid that managed to melt because of the large amount of radioactive material that was around in the very early solar system, and it differentiated. So that makes it one of about 8% of all meteorites known on Earth. So it's less than 1 in 10 meteorites that collect on Earth come from this category that we call achondrites. So not chondrites. Chondrites form the vast majority of what we see. So this one is fascinating from that perspective. And to the extent that we can compare it briefly with what we've seen in what we know from other meteorites, it's probably part of a group of fragments that were blasted off of the large asteroid Vesta in the asteroid belt.
I mean, just generally speaking, from an environmental perspective, is there any risk associated with a meteorite in terms of just its impact on the environment and perhaps its composition, especially because in this discovery we'll be hearing it was made by a 9-year-old child who picked up the piece of this black and shiny rock at the time, reporting that it was still warm when she picked it up in her grandparents' garden.
That in itself is a very unusual thing, and we're going to check the records. Yeah. But we don't know of anyone ever reporting picking up a meteorite so quickly that it was still warm. In fact, she found that the interior of the rock, which it broke open, where her hand touched that, was very cold, which is what we expect. This thing has been in outer space where it's nearly absolute zero.
Yeah.
The heating is only right just on the edge. But in general, the rocks, they're not going to be unusual in the sense of kryptonite or full of radioactive material or things like that that we read about in the science fiction literature. It's a fairly common or garden association of minerals that we find. And this is one of the beauties of this rock, is that it will give us a glimpse of the sorts of processes that happened and the sorts of things that went into the makeup of our own planet. So not only are we seeing material that came from outer space and has literally landed in our laps, but we're also seeing that it gives us a snapshot of what's happening deep within our own planet that we can never access.
And that is fascinating on its own. There's also a lot of a lot to read, in fact, in the public interest just behind this find. What are some of the common misconceptions about meteorites, for one, that's important for you to address?
That's a very long question. The public misconception, well, I think really, if I can step away from that and just say, the misconceptions stemmed from what people saw and experienced when this happened. Some people saw the bright lights, then heard a very loud noise, sometimes painful to the ears, a few minutes later. And everyone is under the impression that everything that they saw was very close to them or was very nearby. What we know is that what people saw was above nearly 40 kilometers in the sky. So people saw incredible distances. And because of that, the sound that was being created by this hypervelocity rock coming into the atmosphere, it was literally punching through the sound barrier successively. And those sound waves only arrived 3, 4, 5 minutes later than the actual sight of the thing. It's much like lightning and thunder. The thunder arrives after the lightning. So the misconceptions were that these were maybe unrelated things. And what we've been able to do is to put together an explanation then of how all these phenomena are linked, how the rock is linked to the light and is linked to the sound, and even to the ground shaking that occurred in some parts of the region.
Fascinating. Prof, thank you so much for your time. Professor Roger Gibson there from the School of Geosciences at Wits University. Of course, fascinating comments there, also speaking largely to the possibilities of what's out there on our solar system.